Hello, I'm Brian Lucareli, Director of our Private Client Services Group and co-chair of our Family Offices team at Foley and Lardner. And today I'm here with Ben Rikkers, a partner and member of our transaction group. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Brian.
And today we're going to discuss aircraft acquisition and ownership. But before we get started, Ben, would you mind sharing a little bit of your professional background with our audience, and then we'll jump right into it?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, Brian. Yeah, Brian, I'm a 17-year partner here at Foley and Lardner, also the chair of our aircraft transactional group. And so I usually get brought in on any sort of client needs around aircraft acquisition, structuring, sale, or purchase. So happy to chat with you about aircraft acquisitions and other aircraft-related matters.
Perfect. So obviously a big topic and it could be longer session than we have for today, but let's jump right into it, and probably a loaded question to start with. So what is the process for acquiring an aircraft?
Yeah, I think the first thing that someone who's considering buying an aircraft needs to do is decide whether they're going to buy a new or used aircraft. And often that process doesn't necessarily start with calling your attorney, but I usually recommend first calling or reaching out to an aircraft broker. The broker can start the process of trying to understand what a client's aviation needs may be and what type of aircraft may fit within that bucket. And there's generally two broad categories of aircraft acquisitions. One is either buying a new aircraft or buying a used. And they tend to follow a dramatically different process. On the used side, often a broker will help a client assist in trying to identify the type of aircraft and then scour the sort of the market to try and understand what type of aircraft may be available either currently or in the near future to fit that client's needs. And the process for acquiring a used aircraft, once an aircraft is identified, often the client and the owner of the aircraft will negotiate a letter of intent and then go to, once that's negotiated, we'll do an initial inspection whereby the client will have a chance to look over the records of the aircraft as well as do an initial inspection. If the client still likes the aircraft, often then it'll go to the next phase of the process whereby the buyer and the seller will negotiate a purchase agreement. And there, often the attorney, I would usually get involved in that process. And that aircraft agreement usually is about 20 to 30 pages long, pretty detailed in terms of the process for the acquisition of the aircraft. The most important aspect of the purchase agreement usually is what the buyer can do in terms of an inspection. Because aircrafts on the used side of the equation are done on an as is whereas basis, meaning after the closing of the aircraft, the buyer of the aircraft really has no recourse to the seller. So it's very important in that process to make sure the inspection and then the aircraft condition requirements are met. That process is usually a 30 days to 6-week process from signing of the purchase agreement to the closing of the aircraft. That is generally the process for used aircraft. On a new aircraft acquisition, often the buyer will just negotiate directly with the aircraft manufacturer, depending on the market for the type of aircraft that's desired. That can be anywhere from a 4 to 6 week process in terms of negotiating the purchase agreement, but often there's a long lead time required for delivery of the aircraft, anywhere from could be a couple of months to multiple years before the aircraft's ready for delivery to the client.
Wow.
And similar to that process, there is an inspection process, but it's usually not as in-depth as you would in a used aircraft because usually they have warranties involved. So you have a little more comfort as an acquirer of a new aircraft.
So next question, what should someone consider if they're buying an aircraft from a legal perspective? So putting on your legal hat now.
Yeah, one thing a lot of clients often just assume that you can drop an aircraft into an LLC or corporation and limit liability for anything that may come from aircraft operations. And that just isn't true in most cases. The FAA takes a very specific view on who has what's known as operational control of the aircraft. And if you're operating under what's known as Part 91 or private aviation regulations, someone needs to ultimately be responsible for those operations. Often, if an individual acquires an aircraft, they will ultimately be responsible for those operations. So the way most people get comfortable with that sort of level of responsibility, because obviously if there's an issue with an aircraft, it can be catastrophic, is getting as much third-party liability coverage as possible. If you have newer, if you're buying an aircraft and you're thinking you're going to pilot it yourself, often that coverage is pretty limited. So that's one thing to consider as sort of the broader process on aircraft ownership and then operations.
So very helpful. So then how would someone protect themselves kind of from that liability? I know you mentioned an LLC, but are there other things that they should be thinking of from a
Yeah, no,
liability perspective?
that's a good question, Brian. And like I mentioned, insurance is usually how people often get protected. But the other thing that I often recommend to clients, especially if they're straddling between acquiring a full aircraft and they still want the convenience of a private aviation, but don't need a full aircraft, who often look to acquiring an aircraft through a fractional ownership program. And the one thing, for example, a NetJets will do is you have the option to either pilot and be responsible, not pilot the aircraft, but be responsible for that operational control, or you can have NetJets be responsible, or what's known as Part 135 operations.
Okay.
And often I recommend clients flip that liability to NetJets. I mean, thankfully, NetJets is one of the safest operators in the business, so they haven't had fatalities, but that is sort of a black swan type liability event, and I often recommend clients that can avoid assuming any of that responsibility to shift that to a third party.
Any other things in terms of the liability side?
No, I think those are usually the big areas: insurance and trying to expand and get as much coverage, third-party liability coverage as you can. One thing I often, as a benchmark, often recommend people as they look at the size of the aircraft that there should be roughly 5 to 10 million of liability coverage per seat.
Wow.
So that's a rough approximation. And so obviously, if you have smaller aircraft, there's less coverage, but the extent you're getting some of these wide body aircraft that you can fly to Europe and to Asia without taking the stops, you're looking at 7, 8, 9 figure levels of third party liability coverage.
Wow. Interesting. So, all right. Well, lastly, can you share anything with our audience? Any new things that are happening in aviation world that might be relevant to kind of our family office audience?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's has been an issue, I think, since even the Great Recession area, when some of those aircraft executives flew in on a private jet to Washington looking for a handout and got a tremendous amount of negative coverage, that being on the cover of the Wall Street Journal for your aircraft usage is usually not a great thing, as well as the fact that recently some folks have started to track and post on Twitter sort of where some of the celebrities are flying. So one advent that we've seen that some clients have taken advantage of is what is known as a double blind trust, which essentially allows the ownership of the aircraft to be essentially totally with outside of the public purview. Because often when people buy an aircraft, you can go to the FAA website and just type in the tail number. It'll show the registered owner, and if that's an individual, that's pretty easy to track. And so this structure allows individuals or corporations to essentially acquire the aircraft and basically immune from any sort of public scrutiny as to who ultimately owns the aircraft, which then allows that individual not to necessarily be tracked as easily as someone who just acquires it and has their name showing up on public websites.
Well, privacy is very important to the family office space, so that tip in and of itself was extremely helpful. So, Ben, I want to thank you for your valuable time and your professional insight today, and I want to thank all of you for watching our presentation. For more information, please visit us at foley.com under Family Offices. Thank you.